Now, a bit of an impromptu video here just to tide you over while I continue to chip away at some other projects. But that being said, this topic is probably one of the few early internet mysteries that has still not yet been demystified. And the topic of today's video is probably one of the most infamous 911 calls on the internet, mostly due to how downright disturbing it is. Now, I recall hearing about this call on YouTube years ago, and I've personally gone back and forth for years about the authenticity of this particular recording. And what I'm referring to here is the Ruth Price phone call. And I must say, like all popular internet topics, it's a pretty massive hotbed for misinformation. Now, in case you are unfamiliar with this particular phone call, let me give you a brief rundown. Essentially, ever since the early 2000s, a minute-long audio file has begun circulating around the internet. It has since captured the internet's attention for how downright disturbing it is. And to summarize the call's contents, an elderly woman appears to be calling for help from a 911 operator.
Yeah, this is Ruth Price.
But the operator ends up cutting her off before she gives her full address.
3877.
What's the problem, ma'am?
Oh, well, there's some guy been checking the place out.
Now, essentially, this is a critical error in regards to standard operating procedure for emergency dispatchers. As a result, the call continues with no known location for Ruth.
Well, he went in the back.
Unprompted, Ruth then goes on to explain that she's an old woman and lives alone, and that the man was there claiming to look for an apartment.
I have an apartment in the back, and he said he was looking for a guy, and he comes to my door, and
Yes?
said he's looking for an apartment. So I live alone, and I'm an old lady.
The operator then asks where the man currently is, and Ruth says she doesn't know.
Where is he now, ma'am?
I don't have no idea.
Now, I want to give you a fair warning if you are wearing headphones. The next part is a bit loud. That, and I also don't want to jump scare you. But what follows is the most disturbing part of this call. Surprisingly, the operator says nothing throughout this entire thing, and then the call mysteriously cuts off with no further context. Now, naturally, this raises a lot of questions, with the biggest being, was this recording real? Who was Ruth? And was the person ever caught? And to date, countless videos and other forms of media have hotly debated every last detail of this tape to assess its legitimacy. And while morbid, that's not to say that other moments like these haven't also been captured in 911 audio. After all, these are emergency phone calls. But while every other shocking phone call online seems to have some proper documentation, this one does not. And if there's something that the internet has been in agreement on with this particular tape, it's that it at least sounds real. So I think the first question to ask here is, why is there no documentation? Let's start by analyzing where the phone call originated from. The earliest circulation on the internet dates back to a website by the name of 911emergency.com in August of 2000. The website featured a wide variety of 911 dispatcher resources, as well as a section on the site dedicated to 911 audio. Now, while much of the audio seems to be sourced from a variety of reliable locations, such as calls from the Los Angeles Police Department's own website, the origins of other calls aren't quite as clear. For one, despite the website stating that you could find more audio files at LAPD online, their catalog was slim, and only a few calls found on this website actually came from that source. And the second thing that I should point out here is that many of the calls hosted here were already notorious, and we can presume that the audio files for these were taken from other news websites. But that being said, let's focus back on the Ruth Price phone call. Elderly female calls police to report a suspicious male outside. While on the phone with the dispatcher, she is brutally and The dispatcher did not obtain her address before the attack occurred. This call was before the implementation of 911. Now, based on this website statement, this tape is pretty old. 911 was first implemented in 1968, and it took quite a bit of time for that implementation to fully spread across the United States. And it's worth pointing out that we never heard any mention of 911 on the tape, and nobody else seems to have pointed this detail out. And what makes this detail so particularly interesting was that for some time, people had speculated this call was from the pre-internet era, hence the lack of proper documentation. And additionally, if this crime was written about in a local newspaper or something of the sort pre-internet, you should probably know as well that in relation to these types of assaults, a lot of the times the names of the victims aren't released until authorities do so, or additionally the name can be withheld at the request of the family. Now, at first, I was very skeptical of this audio, as anybody could submit this audio to this website, but based on some bits and pieces of what I could find about who owned this website, it appears to have been curated by a practicing 911 operator at the time. And I was able to verify all of these details about their profession as well. And considering this person is not a public figure, for the sake of this video, let's just call them C. I managed to find that C was running a new business after retiring, and I reached out to her. Now, it took a while, but she did end up getting back to me with some information that has never been shared before about this particular case. Here's what she had to say. Hi there. Sorry, I meant to respond to you earlier. I was a 911 dispatcher from 1990 to 2016. That particular call was a 911 training call. I'm not sure where it originated, but I do believe it was authentic. My best guess is that the incident occurred well before 1990. I was told that it either occurred before the 911 system was in place, or the call came in on a non-911 line. The reason why it made a good training call was that the dispatcher cut the caller off before a valid address was obtained. It was also my understanding that the caller was brutally and before they were able to locate her. Additionally, I went on to ask her how she first came in contact with the tape. She stated this. I first heard it in the early 90s. It was before the internet was a thing. I copied it from an old school cassette tape. Now, while we have covered where the audio first originated, let's now break it down and actually get to how this spread online and the subsequent rumors to see what can be ruled out. While C seems to be responsible for first uploading the audio to the internet, a pro-firearms site by the name of Marksman seems to be the one that popularized it thereafter. And hereafter, it would appear on officer.org, and then a user by the name of HNDLC3 would respond to a post about the audio file, and our user would write the following. I've heard this one before. This tape has stuck with me these last few years. It has reminded me not to treat every call as routine. During my dispatcher class, our instructor pointed out how the dispatcher sounded disinterested in the lady's problem. Had she not cut her off from giving her address, the police may have been there sooner. I don't know if the agency had an ANI or ALI or E911 when this happened, but our instructor said that it took a while to find her. Obviously too late. The scumbag deserves whatever punishment we could legally inflict on him, and then some. Now, it's worth pointing out that this particular user listed themselves as an ambulance dispatcher located in California on their forum profile, and it appears that a few dispatchers have corroborated this idea of this call being used in 911 training. But I will note in every instance of this occurring claim, it was always presented to them as a real call. Additionally, another comment on Reddit in 2015 shares a similar sentiment. I joined Reddit purely to comment on this extremely disturbing phone call. I'm currently a public safety officer, but in the early 1990s, I worked as a 911 dispatcher in Florida. This call was played for us as a part of a training exercise as an example of why it's so critical to ask for a caller's address before anything else. As a result of similar incidents, it's been policy across various departments to state 911, what is your location, before asking anything else. My sense is that this audio is prolific within training programs for 911 operators, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's still used to this day. I've scoured the internet for more information ever since stumbling back on it a few years ago, but I found nothing concrete. What little info there is matches up with what I was told in the early 90s. The call was made in 1988. The caller was an elderly woman by the name of Ruth Price. She was killed by a prowler, and the prowler was not apprehended. I'm so frustrated by the lack of any credible information about the call. The oldest post I could find dates back to 2002 on a police message board. On that forum, another user, which we already talked about, also references hearing it in a police dispatch class. I'm absolutely certain it's as old as at least the 80s. If I had known it had come back to haunt me decades later, I would have asked so many more questions about it at the time. If anyone has more info, please provide. Now, I will note this commenter's mention of 1988 seems to be a randomly added detail. The mention of 1988 doesn't occur anywhere else on the internet before this comment. While some people have pointed to an obituary for one Ruth Price, who died on this particular year, this woman died of an illness. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that not a single training organization has ever confirmed to have used this as a part of their curriculum. Despite many operators claiming that they have heard it there, no spokesman has ever clarified the origins of this tape. Additionally, when Scare Theater covered this a couple years ago, he reached out to various 911 training centers, and they all claimed that they either had no knowledge of the call or they could not confirm or deny the authenticity of the tape. However, I will note another interesting rumor appeared on a Reddit thread from around 2017, where a user stated, "This is the call that changed my mind when I applied to be a 911 dispatcher. I was near the end of a long application process, heard this, and realized I couldn't deal with hearing this kind of thing, even if it was once in a great while. The department I was applying for wouldn't even tell us what happened to the woman." Citing the fact that the 911 operators often don't know the outcome of the calls they answer, I can't imagine how it feels to be taking a call like this in a real and urgent emergency situation. Now, this particular comment got me thinking. Perhaps the reason that no training organization has never confirmed or denied its existence has to do with the fact that they might not know either, or it's some kind of additional test meant to weed out applicants. On the other hand, though, a poll I found on the 911 dispatcher subreddit shows that a large portion of dispatchers had no idea this call even existed, so perhaps not every person who goes through this training is familiar with this call. While I'd love to write this off simply as a fake made up by the training organizations, one thing that irked me while trying to find other Prowler cases associated to this was just how poorly documented a lot of these things were. And additionally, reading up on other cases like this, what I found interesting as well was that the Prowlers would often cut the phone lines prior to a robbery or break-in. And the fact that criminals were cutting phone lines prior to entering implies the existence of old phone tapes where the victim at least tried to call the police. Continuing on with the spread of this phone call throughout the years, however, the reach was far and wide. For instance, it ended up being sampled as the scream in the game Nun Massacre. Now, on their wiki, they take a pretty harsh stance that this particular call was fake, and apparently they later claimed that they used a voice actor to, quote, recreate the scream. Now, I don't know how you recreate a scream, but continuing on, it has reached as far as to an artist by the name of William Control in 2008, where the full phone call appears as a hidden track on one of his albums. Now, questionable sampling decisions aside, if there is something I have learned from researching topics like this, it's that whenever something creepy pops up with no discernible origin, and nobody can fully explain it, you can bet your ass that people will start popping up left and right to start making shit up for the sake of creating an urban legend. Someone went as far as to create a full Wikipedia entry and backstory, fake photo, and went on to claim that this woman had passed away in 2014 to a man by the name of Soviet Steve. Additionally, this photo used for Ruth can be tied to a 92-year-old Florida woman who shot her neighbor after he refused to kiss her on the cheek before leaving. Moreover, in 2017, the cable channel A&E, on the Latin American version of their website, randomly attributed this photo of a random grandmother to a Ruth Price Wheeler, who died in 2015 from Alzheimer's. So to this day, if you Google Ruth Price, this random picture of someone's grandmother shows up. Additionally, another random detail I found online is that around 2017, an unlisted video on YouTube seems to have altered Ruth's name to Ruth Price Dugan, or Dugas. An obituary does in fact exist for one Ruth Anna Price Dugan in 1944. However, I could not find any other details about this woman's passing, so I have no idea how this uploader could claim that many people believed her name to be this, if no prior reference to Dugan exists before this upload. Moreover, as time has passed, there have been two versions of the call that have been circulating online. One where Ruth's name is censored, and another version we listened to does not censor her full name. That being said though, perhaps the closest this came to being solved was in September of 2019, and it appeared that some circumstantial evidence could be tied to one particular Ruth Price. Because around this time, this led the internet to one particular Ruth Price in San Diego, California. If you recall, Ruth states 3877 as the start of her address, so one user on Reddit thought to search for a Ruth Price who lived in an address with a prefix of 3877. Surprisingly, they found a match. Where, looking at Google Street View, you could see that these homes were multifamily with an apartment in the back, and that seemed to line up with the call's dialogue pretty neatly. However, it's only until you realize that Ruth Price passed away in 1994, and this woman died of an illness, and despite this, many people have cited this as solved, but it just simply isn't. Ultimately, I think the best way to summarize what we've covered is that this call has basically become an urban legend. And the Ruth Price phone call may have existed as an urban legend before even being uploaded onto the internet. While it has definitely been used for training, it appears that the origin of the call is still apocryphal. And after spending way too much time on this, I would say, in my opinion, if the tape is real, the reason Ruth Price hasn't been identified likely has to do with years of misinformation, poor documentation, and perhaps the nature of the crime that it may be attached to. Keep in mind, it's been 2 decades here on the internet, and nobody else seems to have brought up the fact that this call has no mention of 911 on it, and the original source of this audio claims this was a pre-911 tape. Additionally, it doesn't help that the name Ruth Price is absurdly common. On the other hand, if the tape is fake, that's not to say that similar audio doesn't exist in archives. The fact that prowlers cut phone lines as a standard practice pre-cell phones show that similar audio exists somewhere in archives, so ultimately it's worth considering that for context. Based on C's statement, it appears that this tape was circulating around on cassette tape for years, and given this fact, we have no idea how many hands this tape passed through before coming online. And I must say, I've looked through countless archives for some other piece of evidence, or some similar incident that could lead to a potential candidate, but the search is honestly just a needle in a haystack. So ultimately, I lean just a tad more on this tape being real rather than fake, but I honestly think you can make an argument for either side. And while I'd obviously love to know what you guys think about all of this, for now I must say the mystery of Ruth Price will continue as an urban legend until some other new info comes forward to suggest otherwise. But for now though, this is Barely Sociable. Have a good night.